you are.
All right. Our bumper went away, so I'm going to assume that we are live. I'm Deirdre Murphy. I write speculative fiction, mostly fantasy, and I've written some YA and some arguably not YA. Uh, and I have been asked to moderate the panel. So I guess the first thing is I'll ask everybody to introduce themselves. Why don't we start with Farah?
Hi, I'm Farah Mendelsohn. I'm an academic, or used to be, and I'm here because I've written 2 books, The Intergalactic Playground, which is on science fiction for children and teens, and the Cambridge Introduction to Children's Fantasy Literature with my colleague Mike Levy.
Great. Catherine Sullivan?
I'm Catherine Sullivan. I write young adult and middle grade fantasy and science fiction, short story collection, which is in the Zumaya Dealer's Room. And I've been reading a lot of middle grade and young adult fiction.
Sherwood, do you want to go next?
My name is Sherwood Smith. Pronouns she, her, they, them. I have written for children, teens, and adults, and I was a teacher for 30 years. So I kind of look at literature from the point of view of a writer as well as a teacher and a mom.
Okay. And Alma?
Hi, I'm Alma Alexandra. I write for everybody. I kind of accidentally wrote for young adults, although I consider my books to be for anybody who wishes to read them. And at one point, one of the booksellers I met said to me that you write for people who already know how to read. So I'm going to take that as a compliment.
Great.
I think Alma's frozen.
Well, I hope not. But if she is, I hope she'll. Yeah, it does.
I'm just.
Oh, good, you're back. So I guess the first question is, what is and I don't want to spend the whole hour on this, but really quickly, what is the difference? What makes YA different than other stories?
It's about growing up. If you're going to generalize, it tends to be about growing up, looking forward to growing up, whereas an adult novel written for adults assumes adulthood.
Okay. Any other perspectives?
Well, it used to be classics that if you had the rite of passage, they were going up, but it was an adult looking back, and they still put it in YA. And just recently, librarians are telling me that, no, that's not put in adult. So it's not really considered YA anymore.
I think one of the things I would identify for modern YA, the thing I want to say is I don't think YA is necessarily the same as teen fiction. I think YA, as it's emerged, has a set of values.
Yes.
And one of the things that modern YA has developed is a rather intense inward focus on one's own response to the world around one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Which is a part of growing up. Mm-hmm. What traditional publishers consider YA has changed drastically over the last 30 years.
Absolutely. It looks very, very different. If you look back, so one of the things I talk about in my own work is it seems to tie with the rise in the school leaving age.
Yes.
That if you go back 30 years when kids are expecting to go into work at the age of 15, 16, 17, actually 50 years, not 30, I'm 52 now. But the school leaving age when I was at school was 16. We're currently having, in the UK, we're currently having to remind people GCSEs at 16 aren't leaving exams anymore. Employers don't give a damn about them. The kids still have 2 more years. And one of the developments in modern YA is about how do you deal with teenagers who think of themselves as growing into adulthood and maturity, who can be as much as 5 to 10 years away from adult responsibilities.
Yes.
And although I do want to say that that's very cultural, very contingent, very class-based in all sorts of ways.
It's also a question of things having changed dramatically. I mean, you're talking about 50 years, but the modern concept of a teenager is still a very modern concept, even the 50 years ago. I mean, before, people in the Middle Ages, for God's sake, you used to be married when you were 12 and you were considered a wife when you were 13, and that was it. I mean, basically you were grown up.
I hate to be horrible and contradict you, but that's actually not true.
Yeah.
The vast majority of people have always had vast majority of women have always had their first baby around the age of 23.
Yeah.
And then every so often, usually after a war, it drops. And it's only different for the very poorest, for whom there's nothing to save up for and no way to save, and for the very richest in dynastic marriages, where the first baby is still often not till about the age of 18.
You're basically given in marriage when you were both children, and then that is not necessarily consummated in terms of childbearing age, in terms of whatever.
But it's that point that adulthood is laid out for you. And I think if we want to go back to...
What I'm getting at is that a lot of the sort of teenage things that we understood as teenage, as being children, as being young, it's a relatively modern concept, because children kind of stop being children, as you yourself pointed out, a lot earlier.
I think one of the biggest things that connects to that and that really has pushed the YA teen genre is the opening up of choice for kids.
Yes.
That move away from you go into the factory or the mine or the domestic service that your parents did before.
You do what your parents did, and that's kind of
even if not what your parents did, what your parents decide. I mean, my dad told me that when he was 15, which would have been the very early 60s, his parents said, so do you want to be an accountant or go into the family business? And that was it. Those were the choices. And as he didn't know what an accountant did, he went into the family business. And so if there's something that YA does that is YA, it's actually about helping kids explore choices and being different to their parents. That, I think, starts with the career books of the 1950s, which emerge at the same time as the science fiction juveniles, and they have a lot in common with each other.
Yes.
And I would also add that the question of choices also doesn't mean that you get to choose right the first time and get a happily ever after. It's a question of choices, which you may or may not get right the first time. Then you have to live with the consequences of having chosen whatever it was that you've chosen, not necessarily being the right thing in the long run. So you have to choose to unchoose and do something that would make it right. It's a question of choice, but it's also basically a question of, standing up for something, finally making an idea alive in your head, and then going with that. And that's kind of growing up. It's a milestone in growing up, which, like your ancestor with the accountant family business dichotomy, none of them were his ideas.
No, not at all. He was basically told these are the options.
Yeah.
And the next generation down, my generation, basically got a choice between doctor, dentist, or lawyer. And if you did anything else, you were a failure.
And that was boys, usually.
Yeah.
I'm just young enough to have been given the same choice, but my first cousin is 20 years older than me, and she did not get those choices.
Yeah.
My oldest sister didn't get a choice. By the time it was me, it's like, I'm going to college. I don't care.
Yeah. So if we're thinking about what we mean by growing up, I think a lot of YA fantasy is about that, which may explain why the mentor figure is so strong. There's an awful lot of YA fantasy and YA science fiction. Actually, YA science fiction often has schools of some kind. The middle book in science fiction is the school.
But it gets you away from the parents.
Yes.
So that you are enough independence so you could start making choices and examining who you are and what you're going to be, and looking toward the future in a way that adult literature does not do.
And tied to that, and this was something Mike and I put in our book, and it's slightly controversial, is that it makes these things terribly important in a way they are to teens, while the rest of us are busy trying to tell teens, don't worry, it's not the end of your life if you fail your exams.
Yes.
As adults, we know that when you look back, it isn't that important.
Yes.
YA supports the teen sense that it is the beginning and the end of the world. Yes. And I have mixed feelings about that. We've just lost most of the interesting bit we just did.
Apologize.
I found when I was a teacher that if you could get the hovering parents away, that kids were really good at self-censorship.
Yes.
If they hit something they weren't ready for or didn't like, if their instincts were strong, they would say, I don't want more of that. I don't, and they would say to me when I'm recommending books, I don't want anything like X. Usually it was horror for girls. Boys would push into it, but not always. But they were good at picking and choosing what they were ready for or not. And I thought that was a healthy thing.
The way I was brought up and the way that possibly shaped me into this kind of writerly brain that I've got is that if there was a book in my house and if I could get it, if I could reach it, if I could pick it up and I was interested in it, I was allowed to read it. There was nothing in my house that was basically forbidden to me. And if I decided in a self-censorship that this book was not yet for me or I didn't want to read it, I would have put it down myself, and then nothing further was said about that. But then again, I never grew up in a kind of a young adult. That didn't exist when I was a child. A young adult is a relatively new marketing phenomenon. When I was growing up, there was no such thing as a young adult literature. There was children's literature and there was grown-up literature. And when you were ready, you just started reading the adult stuff.
Well,
I remember having to have my mother go in and tell the librarians I could take out science fiction books from the adult section. And then that was that.
Yeah. If you actually look at children's literature, you can actually see it expanding with the school leaving age. It really is I finally came to the conclusion that school children's books was actually a better description. We should probably move on to talk about fantasy.
Yes, good idea.
And fantasy and science fiction.
All right. Welcome back, everybody. It wasn't the end of the world. So you wanted, Farah, you wanted to move on to talk about fantasy. So why don't you start?
Yeah, I actually wanted to raise a book that I thought brought up some really interesting questions, and it's called Fly Away by Kathleen Jennings, and I'm hoping you're seeing that the right way round.
Yes.
Excellent. Yes. It's just come out. She's an Australian writer, and it's got some overtones of Neil Gaiman's Oceans at the End of the Lane. It reminds me in some ways of Diana Wynne Jones's darker work. It's set in a small Australian, I'd say, village township, one of three, where of the three, one of them has died, one is dying, one is lively. The girl we meet is very tied to home and very, very conservative. I say girl, but she's a young woman. And we start to realize she's being controlled by her mother. And in some ways, it's a little like Fire and Hemlock in that we start to realize that the narrative, I'll put this down, of her past that she has in her head is actually not the narrative of her past that the other people out there have. And slowly, as she re-gets to know two people, a young man and a young woman who it turns out she had been friends with but has no memory of the friendship, that it all starts to unravel in ways I don't want to go into because I'll give it all away. But I thought this was really interesting because what the book starts with is a stasis of young adulthood, of a kind of fixed, defined adulthood that I think a lot of us would recognize from the late 50s and early 60s. And that what this book seems to be about is not so much growing up as challenging even what adulthood is supposed to look like. And I wonder if there are fantasies and science fiction for YA that fit that category. That they aren't just about the growing up, they're about really rethinking what the end point is.
There are indeed some.
Talk about your work, Sherwood. You're allowed to talk about your own work, folks.
I was about to say I write about that, but then I thought, God, that sounds so egotistical. I feel the eyes rolling out of people's heads. I think there are other, I'm trying to think of some other writers who are grappling with this question from both points of view, from a kid looking forward and an adult looking back, and defining what exactly adulthood is.
Well, Earthsea.
Pardon?
Earthsea. Ursula Le Guin.
Earthsea is kind of conventionally 60s in a lot of ways. I think there's some more dynamic stuff. It was groundbreaking at the time, and of course,
yes.
it
But
was
what I'm saying is that you're saying that you're something looking back from a different angle. I mean,
Yep.
she did that in the sense that her character was an old man at some point looking back at what happened before. So that's what I'm trying to get at there. But yeah, of course, there's newer stuff. That has to be.
But I think you're right. Looking at the series as a whole, I think you're actually right. Le Guin was certainly examining a lot of these questions at that time, and she has influenced writers who have grown up on her work and are now working and giving us some interesting insights. I'm trying to get my brain to work here and come up with some names. I know I've read some.
I mean, the person I always end up pointing to is Frances Hardinge, a British writer.
Oh, yes.
Who is just
good.
outstanding.
Yes.
And I will just add that to the feed. But in some ways, her work is kind of traditional in that it fits into that. Actually, adults are rather untrustworthy. You can't assume that adults have any clue what they're doing.
Yes, yes.
I think that is a common trope in a lot of children's stroke young adult books. Basically, they're expected to be able to solve their own problem without the adults kind of coming to the rescue.
You know, you say that, but that's not true of most of the books on the Lodestar list this year. And this isn't a criticism. I loved Catfishing on Catnet. Yes. I loved it. But it relies on adults turning up at the absolute crucial moments.
Yes.
And I think that's a new turn I've started to see in YA in the past 10 years, that it's actually rolled back on the adults are untrustworthy, which only really starts from about the 70s. Prior to that, adults are who you look up to.
Yes.
And we seem to be going back to, you need an adult to step in and deal with authority for you. And I thought that was interesting.
Well,
I want to emphasize it's not a criticism. I loved the book.
I think one of the things that's going on there is the evolving sense of what is a family. Because in a lot of these books, the family has betrayed the child for whatever reasons.
Yes.
And they're making their own family, and they need a parent figure. And so they're choosing a good parent figure.
Which takes us back to the idea that one of the ways in which we grow up is we go looking for our mentors.
Yes, yes. Yes, yes. And that's part of the whole school thing, too. A lot of kids really like the school story. It gives a shape to the chaos of being thrown into the adult world. And also, you're dealing with other kids, and that's vitally interesting when you're dealing with relationships, whether romantic relationships or friendships or frenemies or whatever. A school setting gives you a social group, which is your peers. And that's really interesting to young readers.
Let me roll this back around to fantasy a little bit, in the sense that a lot of the stuff that is geared towards this demographic, to the younger readers, to the young adults, the children, they're basically there are a lot of things that you may want them to learn or to understand or to come to terms with. But it is almost impossible to do that in a real, quote, real environment. So you kind of wrap it around in a silver tissue of fantasy, and then some truths become a lot more, palatable. They become easier to swallow, and once you actually internalize them and learned them, they kind of blossom inside someone's head in their own way. But you don't have to force feed that young person that idea. What I'm thinking of, go on.
No, you finish your point. I'm going to address the question that's come up.
Okay. What I'm thinking of, in terms of, let's take something that's looming large in our modern world right now, which is a question of something like racism. What happens if you write a young adult book that is a fantasy novel where you address that point, but without actually couching it in the raw racist realities of our times that they wouldn't have to grapple with, but you have the purples and the greens, and they hate each other, and this is how it all works out and how they come to live together. And once they internalize that idea, they kind of seem to come to an understanding of how to apply it to their own consequential real world.
Okay, we've been asked to actually talk about some modern stuff. Now, I actually helped set up the Lodestar Award. I was on the committee for that. So I do actually I try quite hard to keep up with it. And I'm just looking at the past 3 years and which of these books fit some of the things we've been saying. So 2 books from 2019 that I loved were Justina Ireland's Dread Nation, which tackles the racism issue and actually ratchets it up dramatically.
Yes.
Far from trying to make it more palatable, it actually takes it to a kind of ultimate. And I recommend the sequel as well, by the way. And in there, the adults are beyond untrustworthy. The adults are doing what adults do in the real world. They're turning young people into cannon fodder. In terms of, yes, solving one's own problems, there aren't any helpful adults around at all. But at the other end is Padra Gwilyn's The Invasion. For those of you who've not read this one, Ireland gets taken over by the fairy, is cut off from the rest of the world. Kids within Ireland get snatched away for what's like a minute in our own world, but is a day in fairy, and they have to survive. But in that world, they trust the adults because it's the adults who are training them to survive. And there's some really strong bonds in those in The Invasion and the Call between the kids and the adults who are supporting them. So those 2 books actually contrast quite sharply in their growing into adulthood modes. And looking at this year's, I mean, I mentioned Catfishing on Catnet. The teens work on the internet together, but they turn to adults. And Deep Light by Frances Harding is very much about sorting through which adults are trustworthy and which aren't. And I'm just looking at the question. Somebody says, I wouldn't mind books about adults solving their unresolved childhood issues that they weren't mature enough to deal with when they were teenagers, which actually is exactly what Kathleen Jennings' Flyaway is about.
And I think adults who do want to do that are drawn to reading YA. One title I'll throw out is a middle grade, but it's very much about the kids finding their own family and solving their problems because the adults are untrustworthy. And that's Yoon Ha Lee's Dragon Pearl.
Yes.
I struggled with that book. I found sorry, this is a personal thing. I don't think analogies always work. And in this case, an analogy of one kind of hidden culture was used as an analogy for a hidden individual experience. And I'm Jewish, and coming from a culture in which you have to be careful what you say in the outside world about your own culture, I had problems because you have it so dinned into you. I went from a Jewish school to a secular school, and there are things I would just never have done in school because it was so dinned into me. So I struggled a bit with that book, but it is an interesting book.
Can I mention? Sorry. Coming from a Korean point of view, and I think there's an overlay of a Korean person removed who is not really Korean but is growing up in another culture. So
but it's not the same as growing up as a member of a persecuted culture, which was what he was writing.
True. You're right.
And I didn't feel, for me, it didn't feel, well, basically the kid felt ridiculously naive. I mean, I dealt with that level of anti-Semitism by the time I was 11, for God's sake. I had to move schools. But it's a separate issue in a way. But if we're talking about modern books, this is where I'm going to send a link out to everybody, which, if that can be passed around, this is the link to the Firelit Mag Awards. And people should take a look at the YA and middle grade lists, because Sherwood and I were talking about the fact that all the other lists look really similar with the same names. This list is really distinct with quite different names. And the key book that I would actually point to, and I'm about to open a page, hopefully without losing where I am, is under Best Novel YA. And this is interesting because I don't think it's YA, is Pet. And I don't know how to pronounce the name, so excuse me if I make a mess of this. Akweke Emezi. Pet is neurodivergent. They're living in the future. they're living in a utopia which has got caught in that trap where you can't talk about monsters because to accuse somebody of being a monster is such a terrible thing to do. And we slowly discover that there is somebody in their midst who's a child abuser. And we were talking about what you can and can't do in middle grade and YA. And I think this book has been labeled as YA because it talks about really difficult issues. But I think this book is incredibly accessible to an 8 to 12-year-old. And I recommend it highly. It's a superb book. Really, really enjoyed it. But I would say that I've basically bookmarked this as a list of books that looks completely different and I have never heard of before and therefore should read.
Yes, good.
I see that one of our listeners recommends a book called Goddess in the Machine, which is about a young lady who goes into a cryogenic sleep and wakes up 3,000, it says 1,000 years later than she was supposed to, and she's called the Goddess. And I haven't read it, but I thought I would mention it as something that's being recommended.
It sounds fascinating. Someone in the chat says we can't see what's being referred to. If that's the FireCon convention, I've just provided the link to the chat host to circulate it.
And you might hold up the Jennings book again.
Oh, okay. So that's the Jennings book. But the list I recommended is FireCon, FIYAHCON. And it's their awards ballot. And I think Deirdre's got something to hold up.
Let me know.
The cover of the Goddess in the Machine, but my background is swallowing everything but my face.
I had to look up this twist on Les Miserables in outer space that somebody commented on in the comments.
Can I just say, FireCon apparently comes up as the Ignite Award.
Ah, okay. Oh,
Okay.
That makes sense. Okay.
Yes, I like that.
Yeah.
Catherine, were you trying to talk?
That's okay. I'm going to put it in the chat because when you started talking about Les Mis, I just read a Thai-based fantasy called A Wish in the Dark, and I blanked on the author's name. It's on the book downstairs. But try A Wish in the Dark because it's set more in a Thai-based land, and I found it fascinating. It's more of a middle grade book.
Christina Sundtornvant.
Thank you.
I may have said that wrong.
Well, I would have slaughtered it even worse, so you're closer than me.
And I've just got right into chat to people.
Hey, good.
Thank you. Because that just came out recently. It's like, oh, this is fascinating.
I'm going to leave this chat with so many books to read.
I've been taking notes.
That's the nice thing about these panels. We get all these new titles we haven't come across before.
And the audience should throw us more.
Does the audience have any questions for us? And in the meantime, you said there was one book you thought was accessible to a younger audience than YA. Is there any kind of real guide for how you divide up that middle grade from YA as opposed to adult?
The general received wisdom is there sex or not? A lot of middle grade kids don't want to read about sex. They're not ready for it. They find it icky. And teenagers are starting to think about those questions. It's a big deal to them.
Can I just say, part of the reason I went into science fiction in the first place was to avoid the sex. We do forget, I think, that quite a lot of teens have no interest in reading about sex or emotions.
That's true.
Okay, this is cue for my annual rant. There is a thing I do not like about modern, let's say contemporary YA, because this particular turn is very recent. It's the move from focusing on the world to focusing on the inner life. And I often, part of this is about a move towards first-person narrative. But even if I compare first-person narrative from the 70s to first-person now, first-person narratives in the 70s were always, I went and did this, I'm going to do that. I open up books now and that I thought this, I felt this made me upset, and I don't care. And I didn't care when I was 18. I didn't care when I was 15.
It's present tense, so it's even more in your face. And that's the latest
thing. But the
thing.
result is that for me, if anything, a lot of middle grade books actually feel more adult than a lot of YA books, because traditionally we used to think that, you know, little kids are self-absorbed, they learn to pay attention. As they become teenagers, they get more interested in the outside world. And I swear, I look at the books on the shelves and it's so much the other way around right now. And some of that, I think, maybe that for all we talk about kids growing up faster than they used to, there are ways in which that is simply untrue. Kids are not growing up faster. They have kids from middle-class families, and this is a class thing, have fewer
especially with helicopter parents, yes.
Which I didn't used to believe in until I actually saw it in action one day.
I had to deal with it.
Well, it's become a problem in British universities. It used to be traditional that kids went to their interviews on their own. And now universities actually have to provide events simply to separate the parents from the kids so the kids can ask their own questions. That's a separate issue. So I think there's that issue. But I would also say if there's an issue, if there's something that separates the middle grade, it's often a much more direct question and answer structure, where the protagonists ask questions and get responses to those questions. So Pet, the book that I said in some ways feels middle grade, has a lot of that question and answer interaction, where Pet asks things of their friend and gets responses to it. And I think with fiction for older teens, there's much more discovering things from clues, finding things out by accident, discovering what you thought was true isn't true. So there's an issue there in the way information's handled.
I think it's a matter of tone.
I don't know, because I think you can write. I'm going to say no. I've read books for teens written in very accessible, straightforward language and tone. I've read books for middle grade that were intensely complex.
Yes.
We're in the chat when we were talking about writing books for people who can already read. When I talked about Diana Wynne Jones, when I was writing about her, I said she doesn't write for the child reader, she writes for the reading child.
Yeah.
Yes. There is that difference.
Yeah, I will admit to often being baffled by how things are divided by age. I mean, I was reading I read the entire Lord of the Rings in 4th or 5th grade. And and I saw no issue with that, except that it had maybe a bigger vocabulary than the books they were having me read in school. But I know that's traditionally considered an adult story, not a kid's story. So when I ask these questions, it's in part because I don't necessarily get it. I think books are for the people who want to read them regardless of age.
Yeah. But that raises an interesting question right there. You said Lord of the Rings is not necessarily considered a young book, it's more an adult book, but The Hobbit quite definitely is. And it's a book that was written by the author to read to his children. So
The Hobbit was written deliberately on two levels. It was written with a straight through storyline that the youngest kids could enjoy, and complexity embroidering around it so that the parent reading the story wouldn't be bored. So it was deliberately written for all ages who would get different things out of it at different times in their lives. I have another recommendation from the audience, Cia Martinez and The Moonlit Beginning of Everything. The recommender says, think Roswell, New Mexico meets X-Files.
That sounds fun. Can I just say, though, The Hobbit actually is a demonstration of what I just said about modes of thought. Because for all it's long, for all lots is happening, there is a lot of that. You ask Gandalf a question, you get told the answer.
Mm-hmm.
Not really straightforward, though.
It's written in loops, but there are no secrets. There are no things. The things that are later found out are in the Lord of the Rings, and that's what I mean. You can put an awful lot in a book for kids, as long as you're still working within that mode. But that doesn't mean you can't. I mean, when I was a kid, the thing I loved best was Asterix, and I must have got new layer after new layer after new layer because the books were written in those layers. So I'm always very unwilling to say you can't do X because some writer will prove me wrong, and quite right too, by the way.
And I kept hearing at one point, the middle grade always had more of a happy ending, where Y could be more edgier, not ending with a
except for the animal books.
Yeah.
Could I respond to something that's just come up in chat that I think is really important? It ties in with what I've been saying about we need to be careful about which kids. Christine says a good friend wrote a series for younger students. The white editors protested that the black lead was too mature for her age. So the black editor put them on a bus and took them to a black neighborhood to spend the day. The response was, oh. And that's partially what I mean. That there are a lot of books written for quite sheltered kids, and there are kids out there whose life experiences are still very different, who are earning money from the age of 15,
and
who are
I think
looking
that
after
ties
their
into,
siblings.
we were talking about helicopter parents.
Yes.
And you, without a certain amount of privilege, you don't get to be a helicopter parent in this world. You get to be a parent who hopes your kids can deal with cooking for themselves and cleaning for themselves and getting to school on time because you're working 2 or 3 jobs. And those kids who have those experiences of making decisions on their own and learning from the results of those decisions are at a different place than kids who have to move out into a college dorm to even start making those kinds of choices and suffering those kinds of consequences.
And they don't always want to read about the same problems. An eye opener for me was this is 10 years ago, talking to a pair of inner city librarians who one worked in a barrio and worked in a really poor section of, I think it was Pittsburgh, and where a library that catered mostly to a Black neighborhood. And both of these librarians said they could not keep enough copies of Twilight on the shelves because they had readers coming in who took care of the entire family. These are girls 12 and 13 and 14, where mom's latest boyfriend is zoned out on drugs on the couch. And after cooking and cleaning for the younger brothers and sisters and earning some money, the kid sits down and wants to read about Bella, who takes care of her father. But she gets all this other wish fulfillment stuff, and it makes them feel good about themselves. So they loved Twilight. They read it over and over and over again, where they ignored all these other edgy books about the barrio and so forth. So
can I apologize?